Let me tell you about the absolute moment professional tennis completely stopped pretending that everything was fine. The historic, shadow-draped French Open press room has, over its long and storied existence, seen absolutely everything. It has witnessed explosive scandals, emotional breakdowns, dramatic walkouts, and shocking confessions that went on to dominate international headlines for weeks on end. But on the afternoon of May 23, 2026, when a remarkably poised 20-year-old athlete from Manila calmly stepped up to that crowded microphone, even the most cynical, battle-hardened sports journalists in the world instinctively put down their pens and listened. What Alex Ela said during that fateful afternoon did not merely make the evening news, it permanently rewrote the history of professional sports labor. To truly comprehend exactly why that singular moment sent such profound shockwaves through the foundations of the entire sport, we must look backward to a quiet mutiny that had occurred exactly 3 weeks earlier in Rome, Italy, at the historic Foro Italico. On May 4, 2026, the highly anticipated Italian Open had not even officially commenced. Players across both tours were still operating strictly in practice mode, methodically grinding on the red clay and warming up their physical engines ahead of the grueling upcoming schedule at the French Open. Yet hidden away inside the private confines of the Players' Lounge, something far more serious, coordinated, and unprecedented was rapidly taking shape. 20 of the most influential and recognizable names in contemporary professional tennis, spanning both the men's and women's circuits, had quietly gathered around a table to review a single, devastating document. Jannik Sinner, Carlos Alcaraz, Iga Swiatek, Coco Gauff, and Aryna Sabalenka, the absolute aristocracy of modern tennis, sat side by side, staring at the exact same economic figures with identical expressions of cold, quiet fury. The collective statement they ultimately released to the public that afternoon was not a standard athletic complaint or a vague request for adjustments. It was a deliberate, calculated warning shot aimed directly at the sport's governing bodies. The document exposed a shocking reality. The players' actual share of Roland Garros tournament revenue had systematically declined from an already low 15.5% in 2024 to a projected, dismal 14.9% for the 2026 season. On the surface of the situation, the French Open executives had naturally attempted to control the public relations narrative by loudly announcing a seemingly historic prize money increase, a highly publicized 9.5% bump that brought the total financial pot to an impressive-sounding €61.7 million. That massive figure sounds incredibly generous to the casual observer until you actively look at the corporate ledger's opposing side. The undeniable reality was that Roland Garros had generated a staggering €395 million in gross revenue during the 2025 season alone, which represented a massive 14% year-on-year financial jump. Yet despite this enormous influx of wealth into the tournament's coffers, the actual prize money allocation had only crawled upward by a meager 5.4%. If you run the mathematics yourself, the structural injustice becomes impossible to ignore. The players' true, proportional share of the economic pie had dropped significantly to just 14.3%. The tournament itself was generating vastly more money than at any other point in human history, yet the precise human beings who actively filled those massive stadiums, the ones the television cameras obsessively followed, and the ones fans globally paid their hard-earned money to watch perform, were receiving a progressively smaller cut of the profits with each passing year. What made the entire situation infinitely worse was the fact that these elite players had spent months attempting to resolve the escalating issue quietly behind closed doors. Way back in March of 2025, a unified group of players had sent an extensively detailed formal letter to the leadership committees of all 4 Grand Slam tournaments. The document carefully outlined deeply reasonable concerns regarding equitable player representation, comprehensive athlete welfare programs, sustainable pension structures, and long-term healthcare guarantees for retired competitors. The multi-million-dollar tennis establishments never even bothered to send a response. Not a single word was returned. Because of that profound institutional arrogance, Aryna Sabalenka, the reigning world number 1, decided to say exactly what was on her mind when inquisitive reporters eventually asked her about the brewing locker room tension in Rome. She looked directly at the media and declared that without the players, there simply wouldn't be a tournament to broadcast, nor would there be any entertainment for the masses to consume. She warned that at some point the player body would collectively boycott, stating flatly that an organized strike was the only remaining path to fight for their fundamental human and professional rights. That single word, boycott, landed across the sports landscape like a massive corporate sledgehammer. The executive leadership of both the ATP and the WTA had never faced a crisis of this terrifying magnitude, a perfectly unified cross-gender labor revolt involving the absolute biggest draws in the sport. The French Open, widely considered one of the most iconic and culturally sacred events in the entire global sporting calendar, was suddenly standing on incredibly shaky, unstable ground. Somewhere right in the absolute center of all this administrative chaos, a young woman from Manila was quietly watching the corporate theater unfold, meticulously taking detailed notes, and ultimately deciding that she possessed something far more powerful to say to the world than any sanitized joint corporate statement could ever hope to articulate. Cut to Paris, France. It is May 23, 2026, inside the heavily air-conditioned Roland Garros Media Center at exactly 2:00 in the afternoon. The WTA leadership had issued their official public response to the player demands earlier that week, a document that was carefully drafted by corporate lawyers and professionally vague in its assertions. The press release stated that management had fully heard the diverse concerns of their athletes and remained fundamentally committed to the long-term welfare of all competitors. The veteran players had seen this exact bureaucratic playbook executed dozens of times before. It was the standard corporate cycle of acknowledging the problem, creating a deliberate delay, promising absolutely nothing specific, and waiting for the news cycle to move on while the revenue numbers continuously climbed and the players' actual financial share quietly contracted. But this specific press conference had not been scheduled for the WTA executives. Nor was it called on behalf of Sabalenka, Goff, or any of the 20 elite players who had proudly signed that initial joint statement in Rome. This room had been booked for someone who had deliberately, consciously chosen not to sign that collective document because she harbored an entirely different vision of resistance in her mind. Alex Ela walked slowly into that brightly lit room ranked 38th in the world, a proud 20-year-old athlete carrying the immense hopes of the Philippines on her shoulders. The gathered international journalists fully expected the absolute usual routine, a highly cautious, politically correct young player, perhaps looking a bit nervous under the lights, reading safe platitudes from a script that her corporate management team had meticulously pre-approved. Media members had their digital recorders running, their standard tennis questions prepared, and their patronizing assumptions completely intact. Instead, she systematically dismantled every single one of those journalistic expectations within the first 30 seconds of opening her mouth. She stated with absolute calm, though her eyes burned with intensity, that she used to believe representing the Philippines on the global stage was the greatest possible pressure she would ever have to face in her life. She paused, looked at the crowd, and said she was entirely wrong, asserting that the greatest pressure is actually knowing that the sport she loves, the sport that gave her everything, is fundamentally failing the very people who make its existence possible. The entire room went completely, devastatingly still. She did not stop with generalities. She immediately got incredibly specific with the financial metrics. She reminded the audience that she had arrived in Rome weeks prior ranked number 42 in the world, where she proceeded to push the world number 2 to the absolute physical limit on court. For that world-class performance, she walked away with a paycheck of €46,880. She noted that while that figure sounds like a massive fortune to an average person, it quickly vanishes when you understand that a single full season of elite coaching, international travel, lodging and professional support staff costs vastly more than that amount. She looked at the cameras and stated clearly that for players positioned outside the absolute top 50, professional tennis is nothing short of a financial trap, forcing athletes to lose money just by showing up to compete. She explicitly told the room to let that reality sink into their minds for a second. A world-class athlete who had just competed at one of the premier sporting spectacles on earth, who went toe-to-toe with a top 3 player, and who had thousands of passionate fans screaming her name in a packed stadium, walked away with less money than it actually cost her to physically be there. She continued her brilliant critique by pointing out that when she walks onto those courts, the stadiums are completely full, national flags are waving proudly, and the fan chants are absolutely deafening. She argued that the fans do not show up simply because of an arbitrary computer ranking. They show up because they believe deeply in the spirit of the competition, and because they see an authentic reflection of themselves in her struggle. She declared that the phenomenon known as the Ela effect was never truly about her as an individual, but was always about the people. Then her vocal tone shifted dramatically, and something hardened visibly behind her eyes. She openly questioned the WTA's empty public relations assertions regarding athlete welfare, demanding to know exactly how they were committed, and precisely when that commitment would manifest. She repeated the damning math, revenue up 14%, prize money up a mere 5.4%, and the player share driven down to 14.3%. She noted that while the Grand Slams are richer than they have ever been in human history, the players are expected to be meekly grateful for the crumbs. Looking directly into the main broadcast camera with zero notes and absolutely zero hesitation, she stated flatly that she was not grateful, she was furious, and she was entirely done staying quiet. The press room instantly exploded into chaotic movement. Hundreds of journalistic hands shot into the air simultaneously as voices overlapped in a desperate bid to ask questions. With immense poise, she simply raised one hand, instantly silencing the entire room, and announced she had one final thing to say, not to the reporters but directly to the WTA leadership. She leaned forward closer to the microphone, her voice echoing clearly through the speakers as she stated that the numbers do not lie, and neither will she. She delivered an unforgettable ultimatum. If the executives truly desired constructive dialogue, they needed to stop talking and start paying. She immediately stood up from her chair, gave a brief nod to the stunned room, and calmly walked out the door. The entire historic sequence had lasted less than 10 minutes. What transpired next was unlike anything the insular world of professional tennis had ever experienced in the modern era. Journalists literally sprinted out of the media center, their laptops already flipped open and their thumbs typing furiously on their phones. The sensational headlines across global media platforms practically wrote themselves within minutes. Messages flared across sports networks. Ela blasts the WTA, Filipina star refuses to remain silent. Is this the exact moment the player labor movement finally found its true voice? The video clip of her speech hit an unprecedented 5 million views before she had even physically arrived back at her hotel room. By 5:00 that exact evening, the view count had crossed a staggering 30 million. The aggressive, uncompromising hashtag #StopTakingStartPaying was actively trending as the #1 topic on every major social media platform, translating into multiple languages across 6 different continents. The supportive reaction from deep inside the player ecosystem was completely instantaneous. Coco Gauff, who was one of the very first athletes to sign the original joint statement in Rome, immediately posted a public message that cut straight through the corporate noise, stating that Alex had said exactly what needed to be said, not through a calculated press release or a corporate manager, but directly in front of the cameras and the entire world, calling it an act of pure courage. Sabalenka, who had been loudly sounding the alarm regarding these financial disparities for months, put the situation simply, stating that she had been trying to convey this message for a while, but Alex had articulated it infinitely better, louder, and with the immense pride of her people's flags standing firmly behind her. Iga Swiatek was asked extensively about the viral moment at her own scheduled press conference later that same afternoon, where she called Ela's actions incredibly brave, profoundly honest, and an accurate reflection of what a vast majority of the locker room had been feeling but simply did not know how to express out loud. Even Novak Djokovic, who had been actively waging his own independent political battles for player rights on the ATP side for many years, weighed in on the matter, validating that the numbers presented do not lie, that the players thoroughly deserve better, and that Alex Ela had just served as a powerful reminder of that systemic reality to the entire world. Naomi Osaka, who had previously faced down the immense weight of the tennis establishment over mental health awareness and media obligations, stated plainly that the entire system is fundamentally broken, has been broken for a very long time, and that independent players like Alex are the exact individuals who will ultimately fix it, rather than the corporate administrators or the corporate sponsors. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the WTA communications and public relations teams were operating in absolute crisis mode. The defensive statement they frantically scrambled to release late that evening only served to make the situation significantly worse for their public image. Their corporate response stated that the WTA takes all athlete concerns incredibly seriously, and had already reached out to Miss Ela's management representatives to schedule a private meeting to discuss her concerns in a constructive manner. The global internet community did not receive this corporate response well at all. The public widely slammed it as being far too careful, completely late, and utterly tone-deaf to the structural anger of the athletic workforce. The institutional damage was not just done, it was completely irreversible. Later that night, Alex sat quietly in the calm of her Paris hotel room with her mother, Risa, sitting supportively right beside her. The revolutionary hashtags were still trending globally, her phone was vibrating non-stop with messages of solidarity, and the WTA executive boards were still completely scrambling for control. Alex turned to her mother and asked softly if she truly believed the executives would finally listen to them this time. Risa gently took her daughter's hand, looked her in the eyes, and told her that they no longer have a choice in the matter because Alex had officially forced their hand. Here is the fundamental thing about what Alex Ela accomplished on that historic day. Her actions were not merely incredibly brave, they were meticulously surgical. She did not enter that high-stakes environment swinging blindly with emotional generalities. She walked into the room armed with cold numbers, undeniable financial receipts, and a deeply human story that was utterly impossible for corporate publicists to dismiss or spin. She was a 20-year-old athlete ranked 38th in the world, possessing no historic Grand Slam titles yet, no massive multi-million-dollar endorsement empire to protect her, and absolutely no institutional backing from the sport's powerful governing bodies. She possessed everything to lose professionally, and she chose to walk into that room and face those cameras anyway. She did this because she understood something profound that the governing bodies of professional tennis have never quite been able to comprehend. An executive board can easily manage a standard press release, they can intentionally delay responding to a formal letter, and they can comfortably ignore a joint statement from 20 players if they are willing to simply weather the public criticism for a couple of media cycles. But you absolutely cannot manage, control, or suppress a singular, authentic cultural moment. What transpired inside that Paris Media Center on May 23, 2026, was a historic moment, the rare kind that simply cannot be walked back by public relations executives. It is the exact kind of historical footage that gets played on sports highlight reels for decades, cited heavily in formal congressional oversight hearings, and consistently referenced in complex labor negotiations for generations to come. Revenue up 14%, prize money up 5.4%, and the player's share driven down to 14.3%. The numbers do not lie, and neither will she. The French Open will inevitably go on, the scheduled matches will continue to be played on the clay, and the iconic trophies will eventually be lifted into the air. The television cameras will continue to roll, the massive crowds will roar from the stands, and everything will look from the outside exactly like it always has for decades. But the crucial conversation that Alex Ela single-handedly ignited will not fade away quietly into the night. It will actively move from the insular confines of the player locker rooms straight into the living rooms of everyday fans, and from tense press conferences directly to official sports policy hearings. This is because she did not merely speak for herself on that afternoon. She spoke forcefully for every single lower-ranked player grinding through anonymous qualifying draws on a strict personal budget that fundamentally does not add up. She spoke for every athlete proudly representing a national flag that the international sport refuses to fully invest in, and for every human being who ever looked at those massive corporate revenue numbers and realized deeply that the system was wrong, but simply did not yet possess the global platform or the words to fight back. Now, because of her actions, those players finally have the words. Moving forward, here is the ultimate question that the sports world must sit with. When the WTA finally responds with structural changes, when the revenue-sharing model drastically improves, when the athlete pensions get fully funded, when long-term healthcare gets established, and when professional tennis finally becomes financially sustainable for the actual human beings who play it, will the world credit the backroom pressure from corporate boardrooms, or will history forever remember the fearless 20-year-old from Manila who walked into a room full of cameras, told the absolute truth to power and walked back out? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to Court Legacy for stories that go deeper than the scoreline.